Greetings from my small cabin on the eastern shore of Virginia. My name is Mao Van Duren. I maintain this website to post documents, reports, and presentations on topics of interest that deserve a full discussion in the United States. Today, we enjoy the next installment of the presentations by Leonard Giannessi. He discusses Venezuela and the effects of the United States policy on that country. I'm sure you will enjoy the lectures as much as I do. Thank you.
So the purpose of this slideshow is simply to try to answer the question, why is the United States waging an economic war against Venezuela? And so I'll describe what I mean by an economic war and what the United States' history has been. A little factoid about Venezuela: you see it as the furthest north country in South America. It's relatively close to the United States. Oil is the source of 95% of their national income. It's exports from oil, and they import about 80% of their food, medicine, and consumer goods. So foreign trade is really, really important to the country, and oil sales are really, really important. Here's another factoid about Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. This chart dates from about 2010. You know, for years we thought Saudi Arabia had the world's largest proven oil reserves. About 2010, Venezuela was projected to have more than Saudi Arabia. And as you can see, since 2010, that estimate of Venezuela's oil reserve has gone up to double what it was in 2010. So Venezuela has 500 billion barrels of oil in the ground in the country. So it's just a huge resource for oil. Now, what did the United States do in terms of starting this economic war against Venezuela? Well, it started by President Obama in 2015. He signed an executive order declaring a national emergency in the United States due to the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. And so Obama's basically said, we've got a huge threat to our country posed by Venezuela, and we're going to have to take appropriate action to deal with that country. Now, this national emergency has been re-upped annually. It has to be re-upped or canceled. Obama continued it in 2016 and 17. President Trump continued it in 2018, 19, and 20. And President Biden, just a couple months ago, reiterated the fact that there is a national emergency in the United States due to Venezuela. Now, President Trump actually carried out the economic war against Venezuela by doing a couple things: prohibiting Venezuela's access to U.S. financial markets, prohibited transactions purchasing Venezuelan debt, and actually, more to the point, prohibited all transactions with Venezuela's oil company. And this prohibition has been extended worldwide. So anybody buying oil from Venezuela anywhere in the world is technically violating U.S. sanctions, can be fined, and have sanctions imposed on them because of the sanctions on Venezuela. And just remember how important that oil sales are to Venezuela. 95% of their national income come from oil sales, and the United States said nobody can buy oil from Venezuela. A couple of economists with the Washington Office on Latin America estimated last year, about a year ago, that the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela has cost them between $17 billion to $31 billion in revenue. This is what I mean by economic war: denying billions of dollars of revenue to the country, revenue that they use to buy food, revenue that they use to buy medicine and other consumer goods. So the question is, where did this start? How did we get in a position of having this problem with Venezuela? Well, Jose Delgado, who is works for the Department of Homeland Security, wrote in Military Review that this problem with Venezuela goes back 20 years. It didn't just start a year or so ago. It didn't start with Obama, but foreign military force as a potential solution to solving some sort of problem with Venezuela has been in discussion here in the United States since Hugo Chavez took power in 1999. So the idea here is we have to look to history to really determine why the United States and Venezuela are at such odds. And Pasqualino Curcio, who's professor of economics at Simon Bolivar University in Venezuela, amplified on this point. And she actually, in her statement, says Venezuela is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, to the foreign policy of the United States, not to the national security of the United States, because clearly they don't have the military weaponry to pose any kind of threat to the United States. But she says that Venezuela is an unusual and extraordinary threat because they confronted and have consistently confronted U.S. imperialism and U.S. foreign policy, and that the country has resolved to be independent, sovereign, independent of the United States. And since Hugo Chavez became president in 1998, they've been attacked by the United States. So I'm going to go over that history to bring you up to date as to how this has evolved over time. So a lot of the stories about Hugo Chavez: he was first elected president in 1998, re-elected in 2000 under a new constitution, re-elected in 2006, 2012, and he died in 2013. So for 15 years, from 1998 through 2013, it was Hugo Chavez that had a major say in how relations between Venezuela and the United States sorted. Now, to really understand the change that Hugo Chavez brought to Venezuela, it's useful to go back and remind ourselves that from 1958 to 1998, there were regular presidential elections in Venezuela. There were two political parties that dominated the elections, dominated the economy, but the United States really liked these governments because the governments supported U.S. foreign policy initiatives. The governments gave very favorable deals for U.S. oil companies, and the governments worked with the United States to contain Fidel Castro in Cuba. So here's Fidel back in the day, a revolutionary trying to export communism from Cuba. And in the 1960s, U.S. officials were horrified at the idea that Fidel Castro could gain control over Venezuela's oil. And so the United States and Venezuela worked together. This is what I mean by cooperation from a friendly government, worked together to exterminate leftist guerrillas in Venezuela. And the United States had the right man in the right place at the right time, Luis Posada. He was born in Cuba. He was an anti-Castro terrorist. 1963, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, was trained at Fort Benning, and in a New York Times interview in 1998, he says, CIA taught us everything, taught us to explode, how to blow up things, how to kill, how to bomb, trained us in acts of sabotage. And then the CIA posted Posada to Venezuela. He became a Venezuelan citizen, and he was then appointed by the government of Venezuela to be in charge of operations for the Venezuelan Directorate of Intelligence. So again, this is what I mean by cooperation. The United States trained this guy in terms of acts of sabotage. He goes to Venezuela, and all of a sudden he's in charge of running their intelligence agency. And he, again, in that New York Times interview, he made it very clear what he did in terms of Posada set out to wipe out the leftist guerrilla movements that Castro was supporting in Venezuela. He persecuted them very, very hard. Many, many people got killed. And so I make this point for a couple reasons. One, it shows you what cooperation with a friendly government allows the United States to do. But on the other hand, it also shows you the fixation that the United States has had with Castro. For a long, long time, Castro simply had to be eliminated from the U.S. point of view. Now, Venezuela in the 1970s benefited from very high oil income. Quadrupling of oil prices in the 1970s, just awash in cash going into Venezuela. But it was very unequal society. 54% of the income went to the richest 20% of the population. But Caracas, you see a scene here outside a hotel in Caracas. Caracas was called a world capital of luxury and beauty. And so lots of money for rich people. Because millions of poor people lived in barrios on hillsides around the major cities. You see this just nest of small houses in the barrios on the hillside, no electricity, no running water, no health facilities, and malnourishment was widespread. Millions of people. By 1998, things had really gotten bad. The parties had mismanaged the economy. The parties were corrupt. You can see an estimate that was made. Corruption took 15% of the national budget. 49% of the people were living in poverty. And the two traditional political parties had totally lost support. They had no credibility. They were saying, well, we can address this problem, we can address this problem. Nobody believed them. and nobody was voting for those two traditional parties that had dominated for 40 years. So that's how Hugo Chavez first got elected president in 1998. Chavez was an outsider. He'd never run for political office before. He was charismatic. He promised economic reform. He promised a new constitution. He won democratically conducted elections in 1998 with 56% of the vote. He got that new constitution through. He won another democratically conducted election in 2000 with 60% of the vote. And he kept his promise in terms of addressing the issues. He became president of the oil company because he was president of Venezuela. And he said, look, I'm going to take 10% of the income from the oil company and address social problems with those. He also basically doubled the social expenditures as a percent of GDP between 1998 and 2008, working on healthcare facilities, working on schools, working on getting food to poor people. Now, the economic elites that had ruled Venezuela for 40 and maybe even 100 years, they feared the redistribution of wealth. They thought Chavez was going to take their land. They thought Chavez was going to tax them heavily. The opposition then just focused on one thing, and one thing alone, and that was removing Chavez from office. That's all they wanted to do. The oil company managers, that's what this is a picture of. These are oil company managers, highly paid executives in the oil industry. They went on strike. They tried to destroy the oil industry. Doctors went on strike. The Business Association organized a nationwide shutdown of businesses, and the media, the private media, supported the opposition. This was lots of demonstrations with the sole purpose of removing Chavez. There was another thing that was afoot at the same time, and that was many of the business and opposition leaders in Venezuela visited the United States. This is Pedro Carmona. He's head of the Chamber of Commerce in Venezuela. And in this early time period, he traveled to D.C. several times. He met with senior State Department officials. He sought U.S. support for their efforts to removing Chavez. He tried to explain to our officials, here's what we're planning to do, here's why it's got to be done, here's why you should support us. Now, Chavez, on the other hand, visited Castro. And Chavez admired Castro. He visited Havana in 1999. Castro visited Caracas in 2000. And they signed agreements where Chavez and Venezuela would ship 53,000 barrels of oil a day to Cuba. Cuba would send doctors that they needed working in the barrios to improve health. And Venezuela became Cuba's main foreign trade partner. So just look at the optics here. Here you have Castro, that the United States still, at this time, wanted to remove, and Chavez is embracing him. So you start to see the media, you start to see U.S. officials concerned about Chavez's Cuba ties. Chavez has become President Fidel Castro's closest ally in the Western Hemisphere. Here again, I emphasize the United States wanting to get rid of Castro. Here's Chavez embracing him. Now to talk a little bit about OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. You know, OPEC's goal is to manage the oil supply in such a way that the countries would get a higher price for oil, and sometimes that means keeping more oil off of the market. Well, in 2000, Venezuela assumed the presidency of OPEC, and Chavez said, we need to have a meeting. OPEC hadn't met for a long time. Prices were really low, and so Chavez visited all the leaders of OPEC, oil-producing countries, to explain about the meeting and why they should attend. And one of those countries was Iraq. And so here we have Chavez meeting with Saddam Hussein, and see the headline in the New York Times. The defiant Venezuelan visits Iraq, angering Washington. And all of a sudden now Washington's angry with Chavez. He became the first head of state to visit Iraq since 1991. The visit drew sharp protests in Washington, the State Department calling it particularly galling. So all of a sudden, Chavez is doing things like embracing Castro, just meeting with Hussein, that angered Washington. Well, how did that OPEC meeting turn out? They had it in September 2000 in Caracas. It was a great success. The OPEC member countries agreed to production cuts, And the price of oil, look what happened to the price of oil. It goes from $9 a barrel to $25 a barrel. Chavez gets a lot of credit for that. It brought a lot of new income into Venezuela so he could address the problems he wanted to work on. Well, President Clinton was very upset with this because Al Gore is running for president. They're getting beat up on for not having an energy policy. All of a sudden, gas prices at U.S. pumps are going up. Clinton called Chavez and said, would you please produce more oil so prices would go down and that would benefit my election, or Al Gore's election, and Chavez pointedly refused President Clinton's request. Okay, and then we have President Bush's war on terror following the 9/11 attacks. You know what the United States and George Bush did. He said, if you harbor terrorists, you are an enemy of the United States. And all the other countries in the world were expected to follow this policy. And Bush's policy was pretty clear. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. It's either or. You're either with the United States or you're with the terrorists. And so that became a very simple way to judge countries. Well, right after 9/11, in October 2001, Chavez visited Libya and he met with Omar Gaddafi. And again, it was to discuss oil and OPEC. Well, the United States didn't see it that way. The United States had designated Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism. So here you have Chavez visiting with Gaddafi, and he was seen as supporting an enemy of the United States. So it's starting to build this idea that Chavez is kind of like his own guy moving in his own direction. Now Chavez did visit the UN, the World Trade 9/11 site in New York City. You see him down at the World Trade Center in this picture. And he condemned the 9/11 bombings and attacks on the United States as acts of terror. He was very adamant in saying these were terror attacks against the United States. Lots of sympathy for the American people. But then in November of 2001, the U.S. began bombing Afghanistan. That was our policy. We're going to go in and bomb where the terrorists are. They're in Afghanistan. We're going to bomb them. And so Chavez went on Venezuelan TV. He held up this picture of children in Afghanistan killed by U.S. bombings. He condemned U.S. bombing of Afghanistan. He was a slaughter of innocents. It's fighting terror with more terror. So all of a sudden now he's condemning the United States. You're either with, and the U.S. policy is you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so U.S. policy had to address Chavez. Now, Donna Herniak was our ambassador to Venezuela at the time, and George Bush called her back to Washington after Chavez went on TV. And so when Herniak went back to Venezuela, she had a sit-down meeting with Chavez in his office. And Herniak read a letter from George Bush in which George Bush demanded that Chavez go back on TV and retract his criticism of the United States. I mean, essentially the United States saying, it's our way or, you're not one of our friends. Chavez pointedly refused Ambassador Herniak and threw her out of his office, said, just go away, you're talking to a sovereign leader and you can't make this kind of request of me. The next shoe to drop was in April of 2002, where there was a military business coup, and they arrested Chavez and took him away. And look who turned out to be the dictator installed by the military. It was Pedro Carmona, the business leader who had visited the United States, talking to State Department officials, telling them what they were going to do. Now, what's come out as a result of historical investigation is that the United States knew well in advance that a coup was being planned. And the United States didn't warn Chavez. Here's a democratically elected, he was democratically elected twice. The United States knew that a coup was coming. The United States did nothing to warn him. And oh, by the way, the United States immediately recognized the dictator immediately. And the United States said, we look forward to working with you. And it's like, here you had a democratically elected president thrown out with a coup, and you just ignore all that. Well, the people of Venezuela had a different idea. Hundreds of thousands of people came down from the barrios. They surrounded the presidential palace where Carmona and his conspirators were holed up, and they demanded that Chavez be returned as president. And there were some members of the military that said, yeah, we agree with you, we're going to get Chavez back. And that's what happened. You see Chavez in the middle of this picture. He was rescued after 47 hours. I think this is the only coup that's happened in Latin American history that's been reversed, where the people went in and just said, we're not going to put up with this coup, we want our president back. And so one of the consequences of that coup was that Chavez began to harden his attitude toward the United States. Now, you might understand that. You know, he hadn't previously attacked the United States as openly, as directly as he did, but after that coup, when he saw that the United States wasn't his friend, was actually out to get him and supporting a dictator in lieu of him, this really caused Chavez to pay attention to that relationship with the U.S. I want to talk briefly about the presidential recall referendum process that they have in Venezuela. It's something we might want to consider. It was established in the 1999 Constitution that Chavez helped push through. Halfway through a presidential term, a president can be recalled. All that you need is 20% of the voters to sign a petition saying, we want to have a recall referendum. And if 20% of the voters sign that, then the president has to stand in a recall referendum. And there's only one vote, or only one question, should the president be recalled? And if the voters say, yes, we want to recall the president, then there has to be a new election within 30 days. So there aren't too many countries that have this kind of provision, but Venezuela does. So in 2004, the opponents of President Chavez were able to get 20% of the voters to sign a petition saying, we want a recall referendum. So Chavez had to stand for a recall referendum, which he won, by the way. He won it handily. 41% of the voters in Venezuela said, yeah, we want him out of there. But 59% of the voters said, no, we want to keep him. So he won the recall election. Why is this important? Well, it was important at the time because of the research that Eva Gollinger was doing. Eva Gollinger is a U.S. Venezuelan journalist, and she spent 18 months using Freedom of Information requests to the State Department and USAID looking at U.S. funding of opposition political organizations in Venezuela. In other words, USAID, State Department, was giving money to organizations in Venezuela that were opposed to Chavez, funding political activities in the country. And this was largely unknown. Nobody really knew about it. It was buried out there in the budgets. And so Gollinger went and found all of those contracts, and she began posting her information in 2004, right in the middle of this recall election. In her book, you can look it up, The Chavez Code. So who did she out? She outed Maria Machado, who was director of Sumata, an NGO in Venezuela. And Sumata and Maria Machado were the primary organizers of that recall referendum against Chavez. And look at the quote from Eva Gollinger. Everything Sumata needed to run the recall referendum was paid for by the U.S. The U.S. paid for her to run the campaign to oust Chavez. Well, they didn't have a law in Venezuela that prohibited those kinds of contributions, so they indicted her for treason. You know, they indicted her for treason for taking international funding for a national election. But Maria Machado had a really good friend, and that was George Bush. So Maria Machado's in the White House in May of 2005, and Bush is just talking about what a great job she's doing and with our funding. And she was still under indictment for treason. But in September, later that year, Machado announced that Sumata had got another grant of $107,000 from the United States. Reactions to Machado's White House visit. Larry Burns, who is director of the Consul Hemispheric Affairs, made it very clear that it's clear that Bush had no intention of improving relations with Venezuela. And this was obvious to Chavez as well. Here the person who organized the recall referendum against him, here's the person who organized the coup against him, getting support from the United States, and Chavez says, I think they're out to get me. Now we're going to talk about the free trade area of the Americas. This was a major initiative by the United States. In the 1990s, President Clinton was promoting this, and President Clinton got agreement from all the countries in Latin America to join with the United States and Canada in a free trade area. This was going to be the largest free trade area in the world. And U.S. companies really wanted this because there was a giant potential market for them. And Venezuela agreed to join. So in Quebec City in 2001, they had what was called the Third Summit of the Americas. And Chavez went representing Venezuela. And again, all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, all 34 countries said, yes, we agree, we're going to have this free trade area. And Chavez agreed to that. Chavez said, yes, I'm going to sign that declaration. He was the only official from Latin America, the only leader to say, I have some written concerns about this. I'll sign the agreement, but you're going to have to address my concerns. And those concerns involve the potential loss of sovereignty. Basically, with the FTAA, business rules were going to be set for all the nations in the Western Hemisphere. And Chavez says, look, I may want to set different rules in Venezuela. I want to have the rules for business and labor and the environment under our control. So all he wanted was that question addressed. But if you remember the Quebec City in 2001, this was a huge anti-globalization effort. There were 30,000 anti-globalization protesters there. The FTAA was seen as potentially destroying these small countries in Latin America that couldn't compete with American business. And at the same time, there were labor union officials in the U.S. that were concerned that we would lose jobs here because business would travel to where there's lower labor costs. So there was a huge deal. The FTAA was a huge deal when it came to anti-globalization protests. And 2 years later in Miami, they had another meeting of their trade ministers. It was again 10,000 demonstrators. You can see huge police action from the Miami Police Department. There's a labor guy there on the right. You see his T-shirts. The FTAA sucks. So again, it was a huge effort to stop this. Now, Deborah James, who is a protest organizer with Global Exchange, sort of said what had happened to Chavez's thinking, that Venezuela became the #1 ally of the social movements. All of a sudden now you've got a government. Chavez had come around. You see the statement that he made in November of 2003, FTAA is the path to hell. And so Chavez had come around saying, no, this is not a good deal. We don't want to do this. And he's actually an ally of the social movements. So the final meeting that discussed the FTA was held in Argentina in November of 2005. And the goal of this summit was to restart the discussion of the FTAA. And here are the leaders that were at the meeting. George Bush is down in the middle of the first row. Hugo Chavez is in the back row on the left. Well, Chavez got to the meeting a little early. He got to the meeting the day before, and he addressed 40,000 protesters outside the hall that they were going to have the meeting in. And he's just denouncing the United States, and you see the quote, I believe we came here to bury the FTAA. I know I brought my shovel. And so all of a sudden you have an elected leader of one of these countries on the side of the social movements. This is probably just unheard. Now inside the meeting, things did not go well for George Bush. I mean, Chavez, I say, sharply criticized Bush. He really went after him. He lambasted Bush all over the place for not only the FTAA, but other U.S. policies. You see Bush just being taken aback by the kind of words that he was hearing that Chavez said to him. And Bush left the summit early in order to avoid further humiliation. So in this case, you have the president of Venezuela publicly humiliating a U.S. president. Well, the New York Times covered the effort. And, you know, leaders from across Americas closed this summit. They failed to relaunch the talks. And why? There were thousands of protesters in 5 nations led by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, fighting a successful battle against reviving high-level talks, fighting a successful battle against the United States. This was a high priority for the U.S. government, a high priority for business, and Chavez led the effort that killed it. So there were a congressional hearing right after this event took place in Argentina. And Tom Shannon was one of the represented the State Department, and Congressman Burton said, why do you think Chavez is raising all this cane? Why is Chavez doing this? And Shannon's answer is right to the point. We understood what he was doing. Chavez doesn't see the ultimate goal to unite North America with South America. He felt North America is Canada and the United States, and it's so different than the cultural and the social and the economic activities in the South. He views the United States as an imperialist power. which needs to be contained. He saw the United States as trying to extend domination throughout the Americas, and he says every opportunity that Chavez can get, he's going to highlight his differences with the United States in order to protect South America from North America. I mean, this is a very insightful comment from the Undersecretary of State. They knew exactly what Chavez was doing. This is the threat to the United States that was identified pretty early in the game. We got more activity between Chavez and Castro. They met in 2004, signed a whole bunch of agreements to promote Latin American integration, to promote Cuban-Venezuelan relations. Venezuela doubled the amount of oil it was providing to Cuba. Cuba doubled the number of doctors going to Venezuela. So again, here was a relationship with an enemy of the United States. Castro, somebody that the United States has been trying to get rid of since 1960. And again, it comes out in the press. Venezuela's ties to Cuba raised concern. Castro's alliance with Chavez, given the aging Cuban leader a powerful ally in South America, accelerated Cuba's campaign to break out of its diplomatic isolation. The United States had Cuba where they wanted it, isolated. The Soviet Union had fallen, they had lost their primary support, and all of a sudden now Chavez has stepped in, providing critical support economically with the oil and diplomatically. So one of the things that Castro and Chavez set up was CELAC, which is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. All of the countries south of the United States, excluding Canada and the United States, all of the other countries form CELAC. And the whole objective is to bring those 33 countries together economically, culturally, politically, and it's a collective effort aimed to dominate, to exclude and prevent U.S. domination of the region. So they went out and set up an organization with the specific goal in mind to be able to organize Latin America to combat U.S. power. Now this was in direct contrast to the Organization of American States, which was set up in 1948. The headquarters in Washington, D.C. It's not down in Latin America, it's in the U.S. The U.S. contributes 60% of OAS budget and basically call the shots for a long, long time because we provide the majority of support. But in 2005, things started to change. The OAS is to pick a socialist that the U.S. opposed as its leader. So this was the first time in history that a candidate that was opposed by the U.S. is going to lead the OAS. And again, the idea was that the United States wanted the OAS to take a tougher stand on Cuba and Venezuela. And instead, this Chilean socialist became the consensus choice to head the OAS. It gets a little hairier for the United States. So this socialist not only favored steps to bring Cuba back, he wanted to bring Cuba into the OAS. He had the support of Chavez. So Donald Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice went to Latin America, and they essentially lobbied those countries to oppose Chavez, this socialist, from taking over the OAS. And look at the quote in the New York Times. But they got nowhere. Rice came to the region with the same mission and received the same chilly reception. So all of a sudden the United States is used to having its way in Latin America, and now you've got a chilly reception. They're not agreeing to do what the United States wanted them to do. So Hugo Chavez spoke at the 2005 World Social Forum. He presented the forum's closing speech. He said, and this is a quote, "The most negative force in the world today is the government of the United States, just attacking the U.S." And Deborah James said, "Thunderous applause exploded each time he appealed for Latin American unity and denounced the Bush agenda." So he's having an impact in the world. Now, Cindy Sheehan, if you remember Cindy Sheehan from her days as an anti-Iraq war activist. Her son was killed in Iraq in 2004. She became an anti-war activist. She led numerous anti-war demonstrations here in the United States. She was a major activist, getting lots of publicity and lots of support for opposing the Iraq War. And I bring her up because the World Social Forum in 2006 was held in Caracas. 60,000 people from around the world, 2,200 events. Sheehan was the main speaker Chavez at the meeting also demanded that the U.S. government cease the genocide against the people of Iraq. And you can see what Cindy Sheehan thought of Hugo Chavez. Unashamed, unabashed, unrepentant admiration of Hugo Chavez. He was allied with anti-Iraq war protesters in the United States at a very, very high level. And it was having its effect. You know, Time magazine every year picks the 100 most influential leaders in the world. You'd be happy to know that in 2006, your president, George Bush, was the 4th most influential leader in the world. And Hugo Chavez was the 3rd. You know, he's having a real difference in the world. I mean, he's attracting support from social organizations, activists from around the world. All right, the Orinoco oil belt. So you see that gray area, it's along the Orinoco River. That's where a lot of the oil is that's been proven to be in the ground. And they need a way of getting the oil out. They needed private investment. And so in the 1990s, this is before Chavez was elected president, Venezuela said, we need incentives for oil companies to come down to Venezuela. And so they said, if you come down and start to develop the Orinoco, we'll reduce your royalty payments to 1%. You know, I said they gave them good deals to the oil companies. This is one of those deals. And it's normally 16%. They'd only have to pay 1%. And the operations were going to be joint ventures in which the oil companies own the majority share. So if you're an oil company, you go down there, you own 51%. They would own 51% of the joint venture. I mean, this is unheard of. Venezuela is one of the few countries in the world that allow foreign companies to work in their oil fields. So the 2 major American companies, Exxon and Chevron, signed on. They said, this is a great deal. So in 2007, with Chavez being president of the oil company, he said it's time for a policy change. After all, oil companies don't need incentives to develop the Orinoco. They've got big operations like the one you see there. They've gotten this break in their royalty payments for, about probably 10, 15 years. And so he said, we're going to change the policy. Instead of paying 1% royalty, we're going to make you pay 33% royalty. And instead of having a joint venture where the private company owns 51%, the government's going to own 60%. And so they said, we're going to have to redraw these contracts, and you're going to have to pay more royalty. We're going to have more say in the joint ventures. So this is a picture of Chevron's Chevron's executive in charge of the operations in Venezuela. He signed that agreement with the Rafael Ramirez, who was one of the directors of the oil industry. He said, Chevron's going to make a lot of money. We're still going to make a lot of money. We're going to pay that 33%. We're going to agree to only own 40% of the joint ventures. We're still going to make a lot of money. We sign on. Exxon refused. Exxon refused to sign the contracts. And so they were asked to leave the country because basically the country was saying, this is the way we're going to do business from now on. And so Exxon said, we're not signing on. And then Exxon's field operations were taken over by the Venezuelan government. Now, Rex Tillerson was the CEO of Exxon at the time. And basically, Tillerson went to the World Bank Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. He said, they took over all my factories, they took over my oil wells, they took over all my trucks. I need compensation from them. And so he basically asked for $16.6 billion in compensation. The ruling from the World Bank Court was for $188 million. And so basically, Tillerson got beaten out of over $16 billion that he wanted from the government of Venezuela. This is a huge loss for him. And, he became Secretary of State under Trump. And so a lot of people say, this Trump foreign policy with regard to Venezuela is Tillerson's revenge. So why did Exxon do this? Well, Exxon did it because they adopted a strategy of making an example of Venezuela so no other little country would push them around. They were the biggest company in the world for a long time. And this decision by Chavez, the World Bank, was seen as a important victory for the developing world. So you start to see how Chavez is being positioned worldwide. You know, he's a friend of developing countries that are able to stand up. He stood up to the biggest company in the world and won. Now, this is a very famous speech that Chavez gave in September of 2006. This speech has its own wiki page, Chavez's speech at the UN. And he basically got up there and attacked George Bush. He said, yesterday, the President of the United States, he called him the devil. He referred to George Bush as the devil, spoke here as if he owned the world. And he says, the American empire is doing everything it can to consolidate its system of domination. We can't allow them to do that. So he's right. He's that third most influential leader in the world. He's at the UN in New York. He's condemning the United States. Now, Chavez's speech resonated very well with Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin made a speech in Munich in 2007. This speech also has its own wiki page, because you see in the photograph there, that's Angela Merkel sitting in the first row. You have John McCain and Joe Lieberman from the United States. And Putin got up and he apologized. He said, I'm going to be really harsh in this speech. And he criticized the United States, again, monopolistic dominance of global relations. It's almost uncontained hyperuse of force. He's saying a lot of the same things that Chavez said. The world, he said, has got one single center of power, one single center of force. This is a world of one master, one sovereign. So he's saying the same thing that Chavez said. We got a unipolar world, we want a multipolar. And so, wouldn't you know it, Russia and Venezuela signed over 200 bilateral agreements. You know, we're going to have a national bank with $4 billion in capital to invest. We're going to have joint gas exploration off of Venezuela's coast. Russia's going to be there looking for gas. Commercial air routes between Caracas and Moscow. And they actually signed an agreement to promote a multipolar world. That was what they agreed that should be done. Break the domination that the United States has over trying to run the world and interfere everywhere, and change that. All right, let's see how that played out. So the first shoe to drop between the United States, Russia, and Venezuela had to do with the dispute in the Republic of Georgia. As you can see, Georgia is a small republic right on the border with Russia, and there were two provinces in Georgia that wanted to be independent. These two provinces that are shaded there wanted to be independent from Georgia, and Russia said, yes, we support you. We support your independence from Georgia. Well, what Georgia did was they said, you can't do this. You can't be independent, so Georgia sends their troops in to those two provinces to capture the capital. Well, then Russia sent 10,000 troops in to push the Georgian troops out. And so you had this 5-day war in 2008. Georgian positions were bombed by Russian planes, and the Georgian troops withdrew. And the two provinces were independent of Georgia, largely because of Russia's support. So Chavez recognized the independence of those two provinces immediately. And there were only a few countries that did that. But Chavez did, and he said, I'm going to work using my influence with other countries to essentially gain support for the Russian cause. Okay, and so he's positioning himself as a friend of Russia. What did the United States do? Well, the United States sent a guided missile destroyer over into the Black Sea to within 50 miles of where there was a Russian position. So Russia, has just conducted this military operation in Georgia, and here's the United States supporting Georgia with our missile destroyer within 50 miles of where the Russians are. You see the quote in the Guardian magazine, U.S. and Russia warships took up positions in a risky war of nerves. So you got the United States, messing around with Russia's position in Georgia. What did Russia do? Well, Vladimir Putin sent long-range bombers to Venezuela. And these planes landed in Venezuela September the 11th, 2008. It was the first time Russian strategic bombers have landed in the Western Hemisphere since the Cold War. So Putin is advancing his cause of reasserting Russian influence around the world. And he said, okay, you're going to send a warship 50 miles from where I've got a position. I'm sending strategic bombers to within a couple hundred miles of where you are. So the next shoe to drop had to do with the U.S. Navy's fleet, the Fourth Fleet. You see the way the United States has divided up the world in terms of the Third Fleet's out there in the Pacific, and the Second Fleet's in the Atlantic, and the Sixth Fleet's over there in around Europe. And you see the 4F, the box around South America. So the United States has a fleet of ships that is responsible for that area around South America. And this was really important in World War II. So the Fourth Fleet was formed in 1943, and it was a major formation to prevent German and Japanese ships off of the South American coast. But when World War II was over, we abolished the Fourth Fleet. There was no reason to have a major naval presence around Latin America. There was no threat to Latin America that we needed our Navy down there for. So George Bush reactivated the Fourth Fleet in 2008. And he did it without informing the countries down there that the United States was doing it. So people woke up in Argentina, and they woke up in Venezuela, and there are U.S. ships and battleships and aircraft carriers and Navy planes just off their coasts. And you can see several countries express concern, and you might imagine that Hugo Chavez was one of those leaders who said, "What are you doing down here with your Navy? We didn't ask you to come down here. We don't need you." And more to the point, he invited a Russian ship down. There was a Russian warship, again, Vladimir Putin being able to project into the Western Hemisphere. There were 1,600 Russian, 700 Venezuelan sailors on 4 Russian ships. And this Russian ship sailed through the Panama Canal. It was the first Russian ship to sail through the Panama Canal since 1944. So all of a sudden, the relationship with Chavez and Putin, turning into, a sort of a reemergence of Russia in the international scene. The next major event was the U.S. presidential election in 2008. And relations with Chavez and Venezuela were an election issue. Obama says we've got to improve relations with Venezuela. He wants to have diplomatic relations. He wants ambassadors. We can do better than this. And McCain attacked Obama, saying, "You can't do this. You're going to put the U.S. national security at risk." Okay. The handshake. So shortly after becoming president, Obama attended a meeting that Chavez was at, and they shook hands. And Chavez gave Obama a book. It was a book about imperialism in Latin America, the open veins of Latin America. But the important thing here is that picture, the handshake. Because for 4 days in April, there was coverage of the handshake by Fox News. They fixated on the handshake. These are some of the quotes. "It's a defeat for Obama. There's something fundamentally wrong with weakness. We want America to be strong enough to ignore Chavez. Obama's cozying up to a dictator. This president has a modus operandi of apology and concession." He'd been president for 4 months, and this was an unmerciful attack against Obama simply for shaking his hand, simply for shaking Chavez's hand. And then it didn't last long. The handshake didn't last long because, again, we started bombing in Afghanistan. Obama started bombing in May 2009. There were airstrikes that killed 147 civilians. Obama's maintaining an imperialist foreign policy. It was quoted in Reuters. All right, now we have the story of Manuel Zelaya. He was president of Honduras. He was elected democratically in 2005, and he did some very positive things in a very poor country. He raised the minimum wage. He promoted land reform. And these policies were opposed by the traditional business interests in Honduras. They didn't want this. And so what happened in June of 2009, Army officers crawled into the presidential palace. They arrested Zelaya. They put him on an airplane and flew him out of the country. It was a military coup. And the reaction to Zelaya's ouster in Latin America was unanimous. The military coup was unanimously condemned by countries of Latin America. You see a meeting here with Zelaya, and there's Ortega, and there's Chavez. And Chavez said, "Look, there was a military coup. We've got to organize to turn and put Zelaya back in." Zelaya was a friend of Chavez. So he said, what happens when there's a military coup? We want to get the military out and reinstall the president. Isn't that what we want to do? He was democratically elected. Well, that's not what the United States wanted. The United States refused to call what happened to Zelaya a military coup. Just absolutely refused to call it even a coup. And what happened was that the coup leaders put together a sort of an election, and this Porfirio Lobo was elected president, and Secretary Clinton recognized him right away, saying he's president of Honduras now. And there was no mention of any kind of military coup or Zelaya at all. Now, why did the United States do this? Why didn't the United States declare that a military coup had occurred? Well, we have a base in Honduras. We have a base, and if we had said that there was a military coup in Honduras, we would have had to cut all of our military aid. We would have had to give up our base. And so that's why the United States did not even call what happened to Zelaya a military coup. So here we have Zelaya and Chavez. There was an op-ed in the New York Times. The winner in Honduras, Chavez. So again, basically what a lot of analysts said was Chavez is the winner because it was clearly an example of hypocrisy by the United States. On the one hand, the United States says we love democracy, we don't like military coups, except when our national interests are threatened. And our national interest is that military base. All right, the next shoe to fall was what Obama did with Colombia. Here we have a map of Colombia with military bases. And there was an agreement between the United States and Colombia that allowed the United States to have access to those 7 military bases and unlimited use of Colombian territory for military operations. The U.S. military can go and do what they want in Colombia. And there was a statement that came with this announcement, and the statement says, well, we've got some opportunities now for conducting full spectrum operations throughout South America against drug trade, against guerrilla movements, and against anti-U.S. governments in the region. Okay, that was clear right in as to why the United States is doing that. And again, look at Colombia's border with Venezuela. Again, Chavez could read between the lines, and he says, you know, you're talking about me. I am the biggest anti-U.S. government in the region. So Putin came to Venezuela. And Chavez says, you're planning new aggression against me, the United States. He bought more military equipment from Russia. He bought fighter jets. He bought missiles. He's preparing for the United States to attack. And again, Putin on the world stage visiting Venezuela. The next thing that happened was from Obama. Obama put sanctions on Venezuela because the United States had sanctions on Iran. And it was one of these things, if you helped Iran with its oil industry, you were violating U.S. sanctions. So what Venezuela had done was exported to Iran 2 cargoes of a reformate. It's a blending component that improves the quality of gasoline, worth about $50 million. And so the United States said, we have sanctions on Iran, and you can't be sending them this kind of product because you're now violating U.S. sanctions, and you got to stop it. So what did Chavez say? Chavez said, bring it on, Mr. Obama. Go ahead. He said, we are a sovereign nation. We're going to trade with whoever we want to. We're not going to adhere to any decision made by the United States government regarding our oil business. If we want to send a blending ingredient to Iran, that's our business. That's our sale. And we're going to do that. The United States is trying to prevent that, trying to isolate Iran. And he just called it an imperialist attack. U.S. bombing of Libya. This is another thing that Obama did. In 2011, the United Nations authorized the U.S. and other NATO countries to bomb Libya. And the United States, Obama spent $1.1 billion in 7 months just bombing and shooting missiles throughout Libya. And, you know, we know that the chaos that this created, you know, is with us to this day. Well, Chavez denounced that. He denounced the U.S. Libyan campaign. The U.S. has pulverized a sovereign nation. Gaddafi was a martyr. His killing was murder. The lives of Libya's people don't matter to the U.S. at all. And we know what's going to happen. More suffering for the people, more death. And he was right. I mean, to this day, you've got Libya in total chaos. the country bombed back to the Stone Age by the United States. Now we have a presidential transition to Maduro. Chavez was re-elected president in 2012. He appointed Nicolas Maduro as vice president, but then Chavez died of cancer on March 5th, 2013, and Maduro became the interim president. And to complete Chavez's term, they had a presidential election held within a month, and Maduro won the presidential election. So Chavez, after 15 years of this hostile relation with the United States, Chavez has gone from the scene, and Maduro is in. Maduro is Chavez's hand-picked successor. But right from the start, Maduro indicated that he was open to a different kind of relation. Bill Richardson, former governor of New Mexico, was in Venezuela observing the election, and Maduro called him aside and said, look, would you go back to Obama and tell him that we want to improve our relationship? And so Bill Richardson did that. And you know what? Things got better. Here we have Secretary Kerry and the Foreign Secretary of Venezuela meeting. It was the first high-profile meeting since 2009. They pledged to improve relations and move rapidly to exchange ambassadors. So Maduro says, we can do this differently. Let's get together. And then Edward Snowden's head reared itself. And you know the history with Snowden, publishing and releasing NSA classified documents. He was indicted for espionage by the United States. He wound up being stranded in a Moscow airport. In most countries, he appealed for, could I have sanction, could I have asylum, could I have asylum in your countries? And most countries turned him down, except for Venezuela. Maduro said, yes, we will grant you asylum, come to Venezuela. And Snowden said, yes, I want to live in Venezuela, I don't want to live in Russia, I'd like to come. Well, Secretary Kerry put the kibosh on that right away. The United States canceled visas for people to come up from Venezuela. There had a lot of business officials, government officials, working on this new relationship. And Kerry said, no, you can't come. We got a problem, and we gotta take care of it. And Kerry warned Maduro. He said, there will be additional sanctions on you if we get to the point where you're actually offering asylum and giving asylum to Snowden. I mean, this was a direct element in U.S. foreign policy. This is a picture of the Venezuelan presidential plane. As President Maduro has his own plane. And Kerry warned that any aircraft that they suspected was carrying Snowden would not be allowed to enter airspace of the U.S. or any NATO country. And Kerry said that the only plane from Venezuela that would be allowed to carry Snowden would be the Venezuelan presidential plane, but Maduro was unwilling to make this trip. He was unwilling to make the trip, and as you know, Snowden was granted asylum in Russia. So what the United States was telegraphing here was that it was going to force down any plane that it suspected was carrying Snowden. And we just had the recent example in Belarus where a plane was brought down, forced to land because they thought there was a dissident on that plane, and they removed him. And that's basically what Kerry was saying here. We're going to force your plane down. And they actually did force down the plane of the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, because they thought Snowden was on that plane. So the United States is taking a very, very tough attitude. Samantha Power, who was U.S. ambassador to the UN, she had her confirmation hearing in July 2013. And during her hearing, now this is one of those prepared statements like the State Department, the President, everyone's vetted this statement, so it was no accident what she said. And so what she said was, we're going to stand up to repressive regimes, we're going to contest the crackdown on civil societies being carried out in countries like Cuba, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. Samantha Power is putting Venezuela in the top 4. These are countries that the United States is really going to take a no-holds-barred policy, if you will, because they're cracking down on people in their country. Well, Maduro cut off further talks with the United States. He went out in a statement on July 20th in 2013. He says, I have zero tolerance for what the United States is doing. Any kind of gringo or aggression against Venezuela, he's not going to put up with it, whether it be verbal, political, diplomatic. Stay over there with your empire and just leave Venezuela alone. He said we're just breaking off these relations It's not getting any better under Kerry. So did the United States just stay out of Venezuela? No, the United States continued to fund opposition in Venezuela. Mark Weisbrod pointed out in the Guardian magazine, the United States, if you just look through U.S. documents and U.S. budgets for USAID and the State Department, he figures that there were about $90 million that had been moved from about 2000 up through 2014 from the United States funding political organizations in Venezuela. And, you know, we object mightily in the United States when we detect foreign money in our elections and our political process. We've given opposition groups in Venezuela about $90 million. Now, Putin had a problem with Crimea. As you know, in 2014, Putin said, I think Crimea should be part of Russia. And so he sent Russian troops into Crimea, and they took control of Ukraine's ports and military bases in Crimea. And the Ukrainian army did not resist, and Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Okay? Venezuela was one of only 3 countries that publicly supported Putin's takeover of Crimea. The other 2 countries were Syria and Afghanistan. And Maduro publicly went out and condemned threats made by the U.S. against Russia. So again, in terms of the United States wanting to isolate Putin, wanting to condemn Putin for what he did, here you have Maduro supporting Putin. So this came to a head in 2015, the Moscow Victory Day Parade. This was a parade in Moscow to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. Putin sent invitations to attend the parade to 68 heads of state. He wanted this international recognition. The Russians had made terrible sacrifices in World War II, but of the 68 heads of state, only 17 attended the parade. The United States did not attend, and the United States pressured other countries to not attend in order to protest the Crimean action. And so this is one of those watershed movement days where the United States is saying, you know, we want it done this way. Well, Maduro, far left, he's in the far left in this picture. He's standing one person away from Putin, right up there with the Chinese Prime Minister. Maduro was the only South American leader to attend the Victory Day Parade. And while he was in Moscow, Maduro sat down for an hour-long interview on Russian TV. Putin made a very big deal out of Maduro's support. You know, Russia supporting Maduro, Maduro supporting us. It's a very important relationship for Putin breaking out of the isolation. The same is true in Cuba. Maduro was the first world leader to visit the new Cuban leader. He visited Cuba in April of 2018 to congratulate the new leader. And Venezuela continues to send about 40,000 gallons of oil per day to Cuba. So, U.S. policy toward Cuba, we know what it's been since the early 1960s. U.S. policy toward Cuba has consisted to trying to isolate the nation, comprehensive economic sanctions, an embargo on trade and financial transactions. And you see what the Congressional Research Service says. Look, for 20 years, Venezuela has been a significant source of support for Cuba. So our foreign policy initiative, isolate Cuba, just, put economic sanctions on them. Venezuela has been one of the primary reasons that Cuba still survived. So, in summary, for 20 years, Venezuela has been a major problem for U.S. foreign policy. I mean, I've just recounted the history for you. Venezuela led the efforts that prevented the formation of the FTAA. Venezuela's president publicly humiliated a U.S. president. This is unheard of. Venezuela strongly condemned U.S. actions in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Honduras. And Venezuela has been providing key support for Cuba, Iran, and Russia, 3 countries that the United States wants to isolate diplomatically. Venezuela led efforts to organize Latin America without the United States. The United States wanting to have access, wanted to dominate, and Venezuela leading the efforts to prevent that. And Venezuela won a major court case against a U.S. company, the Exxon. So a major problem. So in summary, that's why the United States has declared Venezuela to be an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy of the United States. That's the reason for the United States can't stand the influence of Venezuela in international affairs, breaking isolation of countries that we want to isolate and destroy. And the United States, is what they're really trying to do here with our sanctions is to replace the current government in Venezuela with a government that's friendly to the U.S. That's all the United States wants. It wants to go back to the old days where U.S. foreign policy was adhered to in Venezuela, and there was this terrific cooperation between Venezuela and the United States. So I think I've answered the question in terms of why is the United States doing it. Whether or not we should do it is, maybe a topic for further discussion, but we have declared them to be an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy of the United States because they are. Thank you.